Hello everyone and welcome back to Programming and Access 2013, the Advanced course. My name is Steve Bishop, and in this video we're going to be talking about importing XML to a table from a RESTful web API. So in the last couple of videos we were really kind of digging around in the weeds, and I hope I didn't lose anybody with all this talk of this web API that's on the back end and all the C# code that you see in here. I know it could probably get a little confusing when you have to go over all that, but I really wanted you guys to understand what was going on the back end from a third-party vendor perspective, as well as understand the low-level communication that you need to have with that API so that you can go out and retrieve the data and see what the responses are and how to format your requests. Okay, all that really was important to understand before we could really continue on with the next steps here. So in this video we are going to actually be doing some VBA code, and we're going to put some of those skills that we just learned into good use. So I have a module in here called XML JSON, and this is where we're going to go ahead and write up our subroutines to go out and retrieve the data from our web server. So the first thing that you're going to need to do is actually get a reference, because out of the box, Access does not really do a good job of communicating with a web API. You need to use a special tool. And there's a library out there. So I'm going to go to Tools, References, and I'm going to scroll down here. And it's a Microsoft library, so it should be available to everybody. And the one you're looking for is Microsoft XML. And I'm going to use the version 6.0, but I do want to talk to you for a brief moment here about something called XPath. Now, XPath is a type of query language that you can use with XML documents to go and specify a particular node on an XML document. What's a node? Well, a node is basically each individual piece or component on an XML document. So, for example, array of contact is a node. Contact is a node. Email is a node. First name is a node. Okay, and these are called these nodes inside of the contact node are considered child nodes, and contact would be a parent node of the email tag. So you can really think of nodes as these tags, each individual tags. Okay, so with that, there is a communication or a query language called XPath. And unfortunately with Microsoft, and I don't really know where this came about, but with version 6.0 of this XML library, there really were some problems with namespacing. And I know there's a way to do it and it works, but I found it just to be really ridiculously confusing if you're going to be doing any sort of digging around into the actual specific nodes and trying to get a particular piece of information from one of the nodes. Since we're just going to be doing a whole import of all of the data from this, it doesn't really matter, but I just kind of wanted to mention that if you are planning on doing some sort of digging around to get a very specific piece of information from one of the nodes inside of an XML document, you're probably going to want to go ahead and use either 4.0 or 3.0. Okay, and they will work just the same as this 6.0. It's just that the communication in order to dig around into those different nodes is a little different. Okay, but now that I've said all that, let's go ahead and move on to the next step here. So again, I've got Microsoft XML version 6.0 selected here. And I am doing early binding, so those of you who are wanting to do late binding, I'm sorry, I'm not going to show you how to do that in this video. I'm sure you guys know how to do that by now, hopefully. Just using the create object method, method in order to create an object. But I just really want to make sure that everybody can see the IntelliSense that we get, and the only way to do that is to go ahead and add the reference. So I'm going to go ahead and create a public sub, and I'm going to call this read XML. Okay, and our read XML subroutine is going to need a couple of different objects. First and foremost, it needs an object to actually go out and communicate with the server. And so I'm going to go ahead and dim an object, and I'm going to call this reader. And I'm going to go ahead and instantiate it, or I'm going to go ahead and new it up. I love that term, new it up. It sounds kind of dirty, doesn't it? Anyway, the object is XML HTTP 60. Now this does come from a library, and I can do MS XML2 dot, and you'll see that the dot gives me the IntelliSense that can give me the various different class objects on the library. And again, that is XML HTTP 60. Okay, so you can do it either way. You can either start from the library name and just do dot down to XML HTTP 60. But since the library is referenced, I should be able to just get to it directly like that. And then the other object that we're going to need, since this reader is what's going to actually go out and communicate with the server, we need some sort of container to hold the actual XML data that that gets returned back. So I'm going to go ahead and call this doc, and it's going to be of a type of DOM document 60. And again, this DOM document 60 comes from the MS XML2 class library, DOM document 60. So you can do it either way. DOM document 60. Okay. So I don't want to new that up. I just want to keep it just as an uninstantiated object because it's going to get assigned a little bit later. But we do want that XML HTTP 60 to be newed up. I could obviously new it up afterwards, but whatever, neither here nor there, okay? So now the next step is we want to actually set up some of the properties on our reader. So we're going to do reader open, and the reader open or the open method accepts a few parameters. And the first one you can see here is method as string. Now this goes back to where we were talking about the different methods when communicating with a web API. Those were things like get and post and put, right? Well, we're going to be using the get method because again, in our web API, the get method is what goes out and returns all 20 of our different contacts, okay? So we're going to be using the get method. Let me go back here to my code. Okay, so get's the one that we're going to be doing. Then we need to pass in the URL as a string. And I'm just going to go over here and cheat a little bit because I don't want to type it all in. Let's go ahead and copy that and paste that in here. Okay, so that's the URL that we want to pass in. Now these other parameters, var async and user and password. Well, you could pass along a username and password. Var async is typically async is something you would work with if you were working in the .NET framework arena. Access doesn't really have any asynchronous capabilities, so it doesn't really matter. We're just going to go ahead and leave this as false. Now the user and password, that is something that you might need to pass along with your request, but typically this type of authentication is something you're going to need to work out with your third-party vendor. Okay, they're going to have some sort of documentation that explains how to communicate with their server in an authenticated manner. Most typically, what you're going to find is a token authentication. And what token authentication is, it's not something I'm going to really explain in any videos here. I'm not going to show you all of that, but I just want to give you a quick little explanation of what token authentication is. Essentially, there is a URL that you're going to need to send a request to. That URL is going to return back a very long string. Okay, so your request to that URL is going to contain your username and password or whatever other requirements there are in order to obtain that token. And then that token is going to be one long encrypted string that you're going to need to store and then pass that string along with all of your requests for the actual data. So when I call this API contacts, if my API contacts required you to be authorized or authenticated through the tokenization system, when you make the request to the API contacts URL, you would have to pass along that token that you got from that other location. Okay, so that's just something to be aware of. Again, you're going to want to communicate with your third-party vendor, whoever it is that's exposing their API to you. They're going to have some documentation on all of this, okay, about what you're going to need to do as far as from their end, how the authentication process works. But you should have a good enough foundation after watching this video that you should be able to understand how to communicate with those servers and get some of that information, okay? So, reader open method is what we're going to do. And now this just basically is you can think of the open method as kind of an instantiation. It's just initializing the request. It hasn't actually gone out to the server yet. It hasn't done anything. It's just, you can kind of think of it as an instantiation almost, okay? It's nothing has happened yet. It's just getting ready to do something. The next step I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and call on our reader the send method. Now this is the actual request. This is the method to go out and say, go communicate with the server. Okay, go talk to the server with the information I've already set up on you. And so this is where the send command is the actual command to go and communicate. Now, I could pass in some other information along with the bot with this send request, but really this should be enough for our purposes. Now, now that we've had the communication with the server, one of the things we need to do is make sure that the communication with the server is done before we get any further, because sometimes the communication can take a little while. And the send method doesn't wait, okay? When you issue the send command, it just goes and then moves on to the next line of code. It hasn't really told you whether or not the communication was successful with the server, okay? So you could begin to start to run code before the request is even completed. And because of that, you need to do some sort of loop that waits until it's ready. So we're going to do a do until loop. And what we're looking for is on the reader object, there is a ready state. And the ready state has 4 different values. Okay, you could get, 0 is uninitialized, which means not even the open method has been called on the object yet. Loading is the object has been created, but the send method has not been called. So we basically did the open, but we haven't issued the send. Maybe we're setting some properties on the object first before we send. 2 is loaded, so the send method has been called, but the status and headers are not yet available. Interactive means some data has been received, calling the response body and response text properties of the state to obtain partial results will return an error because the status and response headers are not fully available. So this is still kind of communicating with the server, right? It's still sending and receiving data with the server. 4 means it's done. It's completed. We're all good to go. The communication with the server is over. So that's the status that we're looking for, is a status of 4. So we're checking to see if the ready state is 4. If so, then we can move on. So we're going to loop this, do loop. So we're looping until that ready state is done. And while we're looping, we're going to call do events. And do events just basically means continue to let Windows process, okay? And this just basically helps prevent any sort of hanging from happening on your code and making the user think that, you know, the application is frozen or something. So now that we've got that going on and we've completed, right? So hopefully now by this time, everything from our request to the server is done, okay? Now we can check to see what the response back was from the server, because this ready state variable here, this ready state property, only tells you that the communication happened. It doesn't tell you what the response was, okay? It doesn't tell you if everything was if the server accepted your request, right? This only means, hey, we sent the request and it was completed. Now, what does the server come back with? Does it say that everything was okay? Was there a problem communicating with that? So in order to check that, we need to do an if statement here. We're going to do if the reader, and we're checking the property of the status, okay? So the status property on the reader is going to return back the status that the server sent to the requester. And if I just go over here to Wikipedia, these are your typical status codes that you would get from any HTTP request. These should probably look familiar to you. 200 means everything was perfectly fine. Okay, so the server accepted your request and everything was good with it. Okay, some of the more used ones that you've probably run into is the 404. So, you know, maybe you requested a web page that didn't exist, so the server responds back that it couldn't find that URL. 403 means maybe you don't have authentication, right? You haven't been authorized yet in order to access that particular area. 300s are usually a redirect, so maybe there's a different URL that you need to go to. Another pretty common one is the 500s. 503 is a service is unavailable, so maybe there's some sort of maintenance going on. 500 would be there's an internal server error. These usually are accompanied by the yellow screen of death with ASP. Uh, so, so you should probably recognize some of these error codes, but most commonly you're going to see 200 or a 404, right? So or 400 or 404, bad request. 403 is forbidden. All those sorts of things. But the one that we're really looking for is to make sure that we get a 200, because a 200 means your request was fine and everything came back just okay. So your request to the server was good, the server said everything's okay, and here's your answer back. And because of that, that's what we're going to be looking for. We're going to be looking for a status of 200. If it was, then we're going to do something, but if it wasn't, then we should probably go ahead and alert the user. So we're going to do message box unable to import data. And of course you could have this do whatever you want, right? You could have this else go maybe loop back and try it again, or do something else, or maybe send out an email of what the problem was. Who knows? Whatever you want the process to be, if there was some sort of problem communicating, you could certainly do that here. But assuming everything was perfectly fine, so you've communicated with the server, the ready state was 4, so it ended the communication. Then it returned back a 200, so the server says, yes, here's your data, everything's okay. Then what do you want to do? Well, what we need to do now is take the data that's inside of our reader, the response that we got back from the server, and we need to put that inside of our DOM document, okay? So we're going to go ahead and set doc equal to reader response, and you can see the response properties here. There are several different ways that the response can be formatted. So you can just get the response body, you can get it as a stream, you can get it as text, but the one that we're looking for is pretty obviously response XML. So this is going to take and format that response in the form of XML. And again, our DOM60 document, or our DOM document 60, is now going to contain the actual XML data. Okay, it's going to reach all the data that we got back from the server is now going to be inside of this document. And inside of the document now we have a bunch of different options. So we can explore the child nodes, we can look at the attributes of different nodes, we could append a child node, we could clone a node, we could create a node, so we could do all sorts of stuff to the data now that we have it, right? So this XML data is all inside this doc, and we have a lot of different things that we can begin to do with it. And the one that we're looking for is save. And the reason why we're going to do save is because we're just going to take this XML document, the data that we got back from the server, we're just going to store it into an XML file. And then we're going to import that XML file to Access as a table. So save is going to actually save this XML data to a file. And I'm just going to go ahead and save this to C Northwind, and what do we want to call this? So let's call this contacts.xml, okay? So we're going to save the document as an XML file. And now once it's been saved as an XML file, Access has a function on here, or a method I should say, that can actually pick up an XML document and import it as a table. So we're just going to do import XML. Now our import XML method requires a data source, which is just going to be that C:\Northwind contacts XML. And some options here for our import. We're just going to go ahead and get both the structure and the data. And there we go. So that is now going to go out and communicate with our server. Once the communication is completed, we're going to check to make sure that we got back a 200 status from the server, which indicates that everything was good. So we should now have some information inside of our reader. We're going to export that data, the body of the content of it, into our document object, which is an XML document. And we're just going to go ahead and save the contents of that document to an XML file. And then we're just going to go ahead and do a straight import of that file that we just saved to our application, and that's going to store it as a table. So everything should be good to go. Let's go ahead and hit this read XML and see what we get. Uh-oh, runtime error. Microsoft Access has encountered an error processing the XML schema in file contacts XML. A document must contain exactly one root element. So I actually left something out here to see if any of you eagle eyes might have picked it up. There's something that we forgot to do. And if you remember from the last video, we were talking about the difference between what we get when we open this up, when we make our GET request using Edge browser versus when we use Google browser. And if you recall, that has everything to do with what we put here inside of our request headers, right? So we have to have a request header. So if I, let me just do this. So again, if I execute this, just as it is, we're going to get back our 200 message, and we get it back as JSON, right? So if we look inside of the contacts XML, we formatted this, right? We formatted the response as XML, but the actual data was JSON. And so that's why our contacts really doesn't have anything in it, because it didn't know how to format it as XML. It didn't know how to read the data. It couldn't encode it. So because of that, because we received just JSON data and we got a blank document, it's having all sorts of trouble trying to import it now as a document because it can't import nothing, right? There's nothing in there. There's not even a header to go with it or a namespace or anything. So how do we fix this? Well, if we go back into Fiddler, if you recall, what we had to do was we had to add the accept header, and we were accepting application. And if we did JSON here, we would get JSON, but in our case, we want XML. So when we do that and we execute it, now we get our XML data. And you can see if I even open this up, oops, wrong one. If I open up the raw response back, you'll see there's our array of contacts. And you can see there's contact, email, first name. So you can see we're getting back an XML response because we have this accept header of application XML. So we need to do the same thing here. Well, that has everything to do with our request, right? This is our request that we're making to the HTTP server. So how do you suppose that we're going to change our request to include this accept header? Well, we're going to need to access the XML HTTP 60 document and add that header to it. But we need to do that before we actually send it, okay? So we're going to modify some of the properties on here. We're going to go to reader, and here there is a method called set request header. And here it makes it very, very simple. What's the name of the header? Well, that was just accept. What's the value of the header? Application XML. And that's it. So now we have our headers all set up properly to request that we get our response back in XML. Let's go ahead and save that. I'll go ahead and debug and compile just to make sure everything's good. And now, let me just go ahead and delete this because I don't want to have any overlapping data, files. All right, and also let me check to make sure there's no tables. Yep, there's no table there yet. Okay, so let's go ahead and read XML, and I'll just step through the code here one time. Okay, so we're gonna open, set our request headers, send, wait until we get to a ready state of 4, which we do right away. Is the status 200? It certainly is. Set the contents of the response back to our doc file. Now save the doc file, and you can see here we've got, look at that, we got 4 kilobytes instead of 0. So we have some data in here. And you can see in my preview pane, we've got our XML data. So now the application is going to, oops, whoa, sorry about that. Now the application is going to go ahead and import the XML. Everything was good, and we're done. Now we can go ahead and open up here, and you see there's our contact table, and inside of it, there's all of our data. So there's 1 all the way through 20. Isn't that great? That is really, really handy, right? That you can, I imagine your mind is going gangbusters with all the possibilities here of having web APIs and other people you can communicate with, and they can expose their data without it being through a SQL server. They can, they can have some sort of web server out there that exposes this for you, and you can go and download it. All sorts of great stuff that you can do. This is absolutely a wonderful capability. In the next video, we're going to do basically the same thing, but we're going to use JSON, and things get a little bit trickier with JSON. Okay, so I hope to see you in that video. As always, please, if you like this video, don't forget to hit that like button and favorite it and subscribe.